Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. When we think of George Washington, what comes to mind? A stoic figure on the dollar bill. The first president of the United States. The general who led a revolution. These images are all true, but they only tell part of the story. They show us the monument, not the man. Today, we peeling back the layers of history to uncover the story of the boy who would become a legend. This is the story of young George Washington, and it all begins in the quiet, rolling countryside of colonial Virginia. So, grab a cup of tea, settle in, and let's travel back in time together to witness the birth of a legend. Our story begins on a chilly winter day, February 22nd, 1732, in a modest farmhouse in Westmoreland County, Virginia. Here, to Augustine and Mary Bowl Washington, a son was born. George. This wasn't a palace, and there were no grand prophecies foretelling his future. He was simply a baby, born into the world of the Virginia gentry, a world built on tobacco, land, and the tireless labor of others. The Washingtons were a respected family, but they weren't among the colony's wealthiest elite. They were landowners, planters, and community figures, living a life that was comfortable but constantly demanding. Young George was the first child of Augustine's second marriage, joining a bustling household with older half-brothers from his father's first wife. Life for young George unfolded at Pope's Creek Plantation. Imagine a world without screens, without cars, without the constant hum of modern life. His world was the rustle of tobacco leaves in the breeze, the rhythmic sounds of the farm, the scent of wood smoke, and the vast, open skies of the Virginia wilderness. From a very young age, George learned the rhythm of plantation life. He wasn't just a bystander, he was an observer. He watched his father manage the estate, deal with overseers, and navigate the complex social and economic web of colonial society. These weren't formal lessons in a classroom, but they were powerful teachings nonetheless. He was learning about responsibility, about management, and about the structure of the world he was born into. His days were filled with the kind of freedom and adventure that only a country childhood can offer. When George was just 3 years old, the family moved up the Potomac River to another property, which would later be known as Mount Vernon. Though they didn't stay long at this point, this land would become deeply intertwined with his destiny. The family soon moved again to Ferry Farm, located across the Rappahannock River from the growing town of Fredericksburg. This move was significant. It brought the Washingtons closer to a center of commerce and community, exposing young George to a wider world beyond the isolation of a rural plantation. It was at Ferry Farm that many of the formative events of his youth would take place. He learned to ride horses, a skill he would master with legendary expertise. He explored the woods, fished in the river, and absorbed the practical knowledge essential for a young man of his standing. His formal education was, by the standards of the European aristocracy, quite limited. He didn't attend college like some of his contemporaries, such as Thomas Jefferson. His schooling was practical, focusing on mathematics, trigonometry, and, most importantly, land surveying. This wasn't just an academic exercise. Surveying was a vital and lucrative skill in a colony where land was the ultimate measure of wealth and power. It required precision, meticulous record-keeping, and a deep understanding of the landscape. These were all traits that would define Washington's character throughout his life. His surviving copybooks from this period show a boy with neat handwriting, a knack for numbers, and a serious, disciplined mind. He wasn't just doing his homework. He was honing the tools that would allow him to map out not just parcels of land, but the future of a nation. But what about the famous stories, like the cherry tree? You know the one, "I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my little hatchet." It's a wonderful tale about honesty, but it's most likely just that, a tale. It was invented by an early biographer, Parson Weems, to illustrate Washington's virtuous character. While the story itself may not be true, it points to a recognized quality in the young man. Even as a boy, George was known for his seriousness, his sense of duty, and his remarkable self. He was a natural leader among his peers, not because he was the loudest or the most boisterous, but because he was dependable, fair, and commanded respect through his quiet confidence and physical strength. He organized his friends into mock battles and drills, playing the role of the commander, a fascinating foreshadowing of the role he would one day play on the world stage. A pivotal moment in his young life came when he was just 11 years old. His father, Augustin, died suddenly. This was a devastating blow, not just emotionally, but practically. The death of his father shattered the future that had been planned for him. Unlike his older half-brothers, who inherited the best of the family's land, George's inheritance was more modest. The dream of being sent to England for a formal education, as his older brothers had been, vanished overnight. This personal tragedy forced George to grow up quickly. It instilled in him a powerful drive, a relentless ambition to make his own way in the world, to build his own fortune, and to earn the status that was no longer guaranteed to him by birthright. He couldn't rely on a vast inheritance. He had to rely on himself, on his skills, his work ethic, and his character. This led him to look toward his older half-brother, Lawrence, as a mentor and father figure. Lawrence was a dashing, sophisticated man who had served in the British military and was married into the powerful Fairfax family. He lived at the beautiful estate he had named Mount Vernon. George idolized him. Through Lawrence, young George was introduced to a more refined and influential circle of society. He learned the manners of a gentleman, the art of polite conversation, and the intricate dance of colonial politics. He spent as much time as he could at Mount Vernon, absorbing everything, observing the powerful men who came to visit, and dreaming of a life of honor and distinction like his brothers. It was this connection that opened the first real door of opportunity for him. At the age of 16, George's practical education in surveying paid off. He was invited to join a surveying expedition to the Shenandoah Valley, a rugged, untamed wilderness, on behalf of the powerful Fairfax family. This was no walk in the park. It was a grueling journey into the backcountry. He faced harsh weather, difficult terrain, and encounters with settlers and Native Americans. For a teenager, it was a profound test of endurance, courage, and skill. His journal from this trip reveals a young man who is not only a competent surveyor, but also a keen observer of people and nature. This experience hardened him, broadened his horizons, and gave him a first-hand understanding of the vast potential and the inherent dangers of the American frontier. He returned from the wilderness, no longer just a boy, but a seasoned young man, having proven his worth and earned his first real wages. This journey was more than just a job. It was a rite of passage. It cemented his reputation as a reliable and capable surveyor, and, more importantly, it fueled his ambition. The boy who grew up on a farm, who lost his father early, and who had to forge his own path, was now taking his first confident steps onto a much larger stage. The seeds of leadership, planted in the soil of his Virginia childhood and nurtured by hardship and opportunity, were beginning to sprout. The discipline he learned in the classroom, the resilience he gained on the frontier, and the sense of honor he absorbed from his brother were all converging. The character of the man who would one day lead a nation was being forged, piece by piece, in the experiences of the boy. This was the end of his childhood and the beginning of his remarkable ascent. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back to George Washington's early years. It is amazing to see how the challenges and experiences of his youth shaped the icon we all know. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter, where we'll explore Washington's first military commands and the fiery trials of the French and Indian War. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series. Last time, we left off with a young George Washington, a boy on the cusp of becoming a man. Today, we are venturing into the wild heart of colonial America to discover how the frontier forged the leader we remember. This isn't the story of a president in a powdered wig. This is the story of a rugged, ambitious young man with a compass in his hand and a vast, untamed wilderness in his sights. Imagine this. You're 16 years old. Instead of sitting in a classroom, you're trekking through the dense, uncharted forests of the Virginia frontier. The air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Every rustle in the underbrush could be a deer or something far more dangerous. This was George Washington's world. While other boys his age were learning trades in established towns, George was drawn to the horizon. He had a natural talent for mathematics and a deep-seated love for the land, which made him a gifted surveyor. Surveying in the 1740s wasn't just about drawing lines on a map. It was an adventure and a trial by fire. Washington was hired by the powerful Fairfax family to map their massive land holdings in the Shenandoah Valley. This was his first real job, his first taste of independence, and it threw him headfirst into the challenges of the frontier. He had to cross roaring rivers, climb steep mountains, and sleep under the stars, often with little more than a cloak for warmth. He learned to rely on his own judgment and strength to survive. Life on the frontier was a world away from the polite society of the Virginia plantations. Washington encountered a diverse mix of people, hardy settlers carving out a life for their families, seasoned hunters who knew the woods like the back of their hand, and various Native American tribes, each with their own culture and deep connection to the land. These interactions were his real education. He learned diplomacy not in a grand hall, but around a campfire. He learned about different perspectives, about negotiation, and about the complex realities of life on the edge of the known world. This wasn't an easy life. The physical demands were immense. Long days of hiking and working were followed by cold, uncomfortable nights. Food could be scarce, and the danger of illness or accident was constant. Washington documented his experiences in his journals, writing about everything from the beauty of the landscape to the discomfort of sleeping on a bed of matted straw with fleas. But through it all, a remarkable transformation was taking place. The frontier was stripping away the softness of his upbringing and replacing it with something harder, more resilient. It was out here, in the vast, silent wilderness, that Washington cultivated the qualities that would later define him. Discipline was not an abstract concept. It was the necessity of waking up before dawn, day after day, to complete a difficult task. Endurance wasn't just a word. It was the ability to push through exhaustion and keep moving forward when every muscle ached. And courage. Courage was facing the unknown every single day, whether it was a treacherous mountain pass or an uncertain encounter in the woods. Think about the mental fortitude this required for a young man, largely on his own, to not only navigate this environment, but to excel in it. Speaks volumes about his character. He was developing self-reliance. He learned that his success or failure rested squarely on his own shoulders. There was no one to bail him out if he made a mistake. This profound sense of responsibility would become a hallmark of his leadership, both in the military and as president. The frontier taught him to be meticulous, to plan carefully, and to anticipate problems before they arose, skills that are just as valuable for a surveyor as they are for a general. The land itself left an indelible mark on him. Washington developed a deep, lifelong appreciation for the American landscape. He saw its immense potential, not just as a source of wealth, but as the foundation of a new nation. His time in the wilderness gave him a vision of westward expansion, a belief in the promise of the continent, and understood on a visceral level the scale and the raw beauty of the land he would one day lead. This wasn't just territory to be conquered. It was a home to be built, a future to be secured. His experiences also gave him a practical understanding of military logistics long before he ever commanded an army. He learned how to read terrain, how to find the best routes for travel, how to supply a party on the move, and how to lead a small group of men through difficult conditions. These were the fundamental skills of a frontier commander, learned not in a military academy, but in the school of the wilderness. The lessons of the Shenandoah Valley would prove invaluable years later during the French and Indian War, and later still, during the Revolution. So, when we picture George Washington, let's remember this chapter of his life. Before he was a general, before he was a statesman, he was a frontier boy, a young man who chose the hard path, who found his purpose not in the comfort of his home, but in the challenges of the wild. The Virginia wilderness was his crucible, shaping his body, tempering his mind, and forging the discipline, endurance, and quiet courage that would prepare him for the monumental tasks that lay ahead. The frontier didn't just shape a man, it helped shape the father of a nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into Washington's early life. It's these formative years that truly give us insight into the man he became. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter, where we'll see this young surveyor step onto the world stage. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the life of George Washington. In our last chapter, we saw a young surveyor mapping the vast American wilderness. Today, we witness his transformation from a man of maps to a man of war. This is Chapter 3. The soldier in the making. The year is 1754, and tensions between the British and French empires in North America are about to explode. The Ohio Valley, a land of immense strategic and economic value, is the flashpoint. Both powers want it, and they're willing to fight for it. Into this cauldron of imperial conflict steps a 22-year-old Virginian, brimming with ambition but utterly inexperienced in the art of war, George Washington. His first mission was a diplomatic one, a dangerous winter journey to deliver a message from the Virginia governor to the French, demanding they abandon their forts in the Ohio Territory. The French, of course, refused. But Washington's detailed journal of the expedition, filled with observations on French strength and intentions, was published in both Virginia and London. Suddenly, this young colonial was on the map, recognized for his courage and resolve. But diplomacy had failed, and conflict was now inevitable. Promoted to lieutenant colonel of the newly formed Virginia Regiment, Washington was sent back to the frontier, this time with a small force of men. His orders were to protect a British fort being built at the forks of the Ohio, where modern-day Pittsburgh stands. Before he could even get there, he received news. The French had already captured the fort and renamed it Fort Duquesne. Washington, now in a precarious position deep in hostile territory, made a fateful decision. Acting on intelligence that a French scouting party was nearby, he led a surprise attack in a narrow glen. The skirmish was swift and brutal. A French envoy, Joinville, was killed, an event that the French would label an assassination. This small, violent encounter in the backwoods of Pennsylvania lit the fuse that would ignite a global conflict. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. Now, Washington knew he had provoked a hornet's nest. He retreated and hastily constructed a small, circular stockade in a large meadow. He called it Fort Necessity. It was a poorly chosen location, low-lying, and surrounded by wooded high ground. He didn't have to wait long. A much larger force of French soldiers and their Native American allies descended upon the makeshift fort. On a rainy July 3, 1754, the Battle of Fort Necessity began. From the cover of the surrounding trees, the French and their allies poured a relentless fire down into the exposed fort. Washington's men, trapped and outnumbered, fought back bravely, but their situation was hopeless. Their gunpowder was soaked, their casualties were mounting, and they were completely surrounded. By nightfall, Washington faced a grim reality. He had led his men into a disaster. The French offered terms of surrender. In a cruel twist of fate, the surrender document, written in French language Washington couldn't read, contained a clause admitting that he had assassinated Jumonville. Under the pouring rain, with his command in shambles, Washington signed the document. It was his first and only formal surrender. He returned to Virginia not as a hero, but as a humbled young officer who had suffered a crushing defeat. For many, this would have been the end of their military ambitions. But for Washington, it was the most important lesson of his life. He had learned about the brutal realities of combat, the importance of supply lines, the folly of underestimating the enemy, and the critical need for sound strategic positioning. Fort Necessity was a failure, but it was a crucible that began to forge the commander he would one day become. He didn't sulk for long. The very next year, in 1755, he was back in the action, this time as a volunteer aide to the British General Edward Braddock. Braddock was leading a massive expedition of seasoned British regulars and colonial militia to capture the very same Fort Duquesne. That had been the source of Washington's earlier troubles. Washington was in awe of the British Army's discipline and power, but he was also deeply concerned. He tried to warn Braddock about the dangers of frontier warfare. He explained that the enemy wouldn't line up for a battle in an open field, as was the European custom. They would use the forest for cover, striking with deadly ambushes. Braddock, a proud and stubborn officer of the old school, dismissed the young colonial's advice. He believed his professional soldiers could handle any savage tactics. This arrogance would prove fatal. As Braddock's long column of men and wagons snaked its way through the dense woods, just miles from Fort Duquesne, they walked straight into a perfectly laid trap. French troops and Native American warriors unleashed a devastating fusillade from all sides. The British regulars, trained for open-field battles, panicked. They bunched together, making themselves easy targets, and their orderly lines dissolved into chaos. In the midst of this horrifying carnage, Washington was everywhere. He rode back and forth across the battlefield, desperately trying to rally the terrified troops and organize a defense. He had 2 horses shot out from under him. His coat was pierced by 4 bullets. By all accounts, he should have been killed. Yet, he displayed an almost supernatural calm and bravery. While General Braddock was mortally wounded, it was Washington who managed to organize the retreat, saving the remnants of the shattered army from complete annihilation. He had witnessed the catastrophic failure of rigid, conventional tactics in the American wilderness, and he had proven his own courage under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The Braddock expedition was a disaster for the British, but it was a defining moment for George Washington. He had seen the vulnerability of a supposedly invincible professional army and learned firsthand the effectiveness of guerrilla-style warfare. These lessons, learned in the bloody forests of the Ohio Valley, would be stored away, becoming the foundation of his military thinking. They were lessons he would later use with brilliant effect against the very same British army when he fought not for a king, but for a new nation. The early years of the French and Indian War were a brutal but essential training ground. From the humiliation of Fort Necessity to the heroism displayed during Braddock's defeat, Washington was being shaped, tested, and hardened. He was no longer just an ambitious surveyor. He was a soldier, a leader who understood both defeat and survival. The making of the general had truly begun. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story is just getting started, and the lessons Washington learned here will echo through the rest of his incredible life. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss Chapter 4. We'll see you next time. The smoke of the French and Indian War had barely cleared when a different kind of hero returned to the rolling hills of Virginia. This wasn't just a soldier. This was Colonel George Washington, a man whose reputation for bravery and leadership had preceded him. He had walked through the fire of battle, tasted both victory and the bitterness of defeat. But he emerged from the conflict not hardened, but refined. The war had been his crucible, forging a young surveyor into a respected military commander, a man of honor whose name was now whispered with admiration throughout the colonies. His time on the frontier was over, but a new chapter, one defined by love, land, and legacy, was just beginning. Imagine the relief, the deep-seated satisfaction of returning home. For Washington, home was more than just a place. It was an ideal, and that ideal was about to become much richer, in every sense of the word. In 1759, a pivotal year in his life, Washington made a match that would forever alter his destiny. He married the charming and incredibly wealthy widow, Martha Dandridge Custis. This wasn't merely a union of 2 hearts. It was a strategic alliance that catapulted Washington into the uppermost echelon of Virginia's elite. Martha was not just a companion. She was a partner. With her came vast tracts of land, a significant fortune, and 2 beloved children from her previous marriage, John Parke Custis, known as Jackie, and Martha Parke Custis, affectionately called Patsy. Suddenly, Washington was not just a soldier. He was a husband, a stepfather, and one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. His marriage to Martha provided him with financial security, allowing him to pursue his ambitions without the constant worry of money. It elevated his social standing, placing him firmly within the circle of power and influence that would later be crucial to the birth of a nation. But beyond the wealth and status, Martha brought him a family, a sense of domestic stability that he had never known. She was his confidant, his partner in managing their vast estates, and the anchor that grounded the man who would one day lead a revolution. Their partnership was one of mutual respect and deep affection, a cornerstone upon which the rest of his life would be built. With his new life came a new focus, a sprawling estate perched on the banks of the Potomac River. This was Mount Vernon. More than just a house, Mount Vernon became Washington's sanctuary, his laboratory, and his masterpiece. He poured his heart and soul into the land, transforming it from a modest 1.5-story house into the iconic mansion we recognize today. This wasn't just about building a home. It was about cultivating an ideal. Mount Vernon became a symbol of Washington's vision for America. Prosperous, innovative, and self-sufficient. He was a relentless experimenter, a scientific farmer in an age of tradition. He corresponded with agricultural innovators across the Atlantic, testing new crop rotations, fertilizers, and plowing techniques. He moved away from the tobacco monoculture that was depleting Virginia's soil, diversifying his crops to include wheat and other grains. He designed a state-of-the-art gristmill and a successful distillery, turning his farm's output into profitable goods. The history of Mount Vernon is a story of constant growth and innovation, mirroring the man himself. When Washington first inherited the property, it was known as Little Hunting Creek Plantation. It was his older half-brother, Lawrence, who renamed it Mount Vernon in honor of Admiral Edward Vernon, under whom he had served in the British Navy. After Lawrence's death, the estate eventually passed to George. He spent the next 4 decades expanding and improving it, acquiring thousands of acres and meticulously designing the layout of the mansion, the outbuildings, and the beautiful gardens that Martha so dearly loved. He personally oversaw the architecture, the interior design, and even the color of the paint. Every detail at Mount Vernon reflected Washington's personality, his love of order, his passion for improvement, and his vision of a gentleman farmer's life. It was here, away from the battlefield in the political arena, that Washington felt most himself. Life at Mount Vernon was a bustling, intricate dance of work and hospitality. A typical day for Washington began before sunrise. A would rise, attend to his correspondence, and then spend hours on horseback, riding across his 5 farms, personally inspecting the work and directing his managers. He was a hands-on deck master, involved in every aspect of the plantation's operation. Martha, in turn, was the mistress of the household, a domain just as complex as the fields. She managed the domestic staff, oversaw the spinning and weaving of cloth, the preservation of food, and the constant stream of visitors that passed through their doors. Mount Vernon was renowned for its hospitality. Friends, relatives, politicians, and even curious strangers were welcomed. The Washington's home was a social hub, a place of lively dinners, political discussions, and festive balls. It was a life of structured elegance and purposeful activity. For Washington, this was peace. This was prosperity. It was the American dream, built by his own hands, on his own land. It was the life he fought to protect, the life he would ultimately be willing to leave behind once more when the call of duty sounded again. The quiet planter of Mount Vernon, the man of honor, was nurturing the very skills and ideals that a fledgling nation would soon desperately need. His time as a gentleman farmer was also a time of deep intellectual and political growth. In the quiet of his study at Mount Vernon, surrounded by books on agriculture, philosophy, and military strategy, Washington was not idle. He served as a representative in Virginia's House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature. Here, he wasn't known for fiery speeches, but for his sound judgment and steadfast integrity. He listened more than he spoke, earning the respect of his peers through his thoughtful and deliberate nature. It was in Williamsburg, amidst the debates over British taxation and colonial rights, that Washington's political consciousness sharpened. He witnessed firsthand the growing tensions between the colonies and the mother country. He began to see the Crown's policies not just as an economic burden, but as an infringement on the liberties of freeborn Englishmen. His letters from this period reveal a man growing increasingly disillusioned with British rule. The planter who desired nothing more than peace on his estate was slowly, but surely, becoming a revolutionary. This period between the wars was crucial. It cemented his status, not just as a wealthy landowner, but as a trusted leader within his community and colony. People looked to him. His military experience gave him credibility. His success as a planter demonstrated his capability, and his quiet, dignified demeanor inspired confidence. He was the embodiment of the Cincinnatus ideal, the Roman leader who left his farm to save the Republic and then willingly returned to his plow. Washington didn't seek power. It was a responsibility he felt compelled to accept. He was a man of honor, and his honor was tied to his land, his family, and his colony. When the storm clouds of revolution finally gathered, Washington's years at Mount Vernon had prepared him perfectly. He had managed a complex organization, led men, navigated political currents, and cultivated a deep-seated love for the land and the principles of liberty. The peaceful life he had built on the banks of the Potomac had given him everything to lose, and therefore, everything to fight for. The man of honor was ready to answer his country's call. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into George Washington's life at Mount Vernon. It's a fascinating look at the man behind the legend. If you enjoyed this chapter, please give this video a like. And do you unforget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you unmiss the next part of our story. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore the life of this incredible figure. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the life of George Washington. Today, in Chapter 5, we're exploring the rising tide of revolution. The winds of change are blowing, and a storm is gathering over the American colonies. After the French and Indian War, Washington returned to Mount Vernon, hoping for a peaceful life as a planter. But the world around him was anything but peaceful. Britain, burdened by war debt, started looking at its American colonies as a source of revenue. This shift in policy would set the stage for a conflict that would change the world forever. The first major shockwave was the Stamp Act of 1765. Imagine this. Suddenly, almost every piece of paper you used, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards, had to have a special stamp on it, a stamp you had to pay for. This wasn't just a nuisance. It was a tax imposed by a parliament thousands of miles away, where the colonists had no elected officials to speak for them. This is where the powerful slogan, "No taxation without representation," was born. It wasn't just about the money. It was about a fundamental principle of English rights. Colonists believed they were being treated as second-class citizens, their rights as Englishmen ignored. Washington, like many of his peers, was initially moderate. He valued his connection to Britain, but he couldn't ignore the injustice. He saw these taxes as an attack on their liberties and their property. In his letters from this period, you can feel his frustration growing. He described the Stamp Act as an unconstitutional method of taxation and a direful attack upon their liberties. He wasn't a radical firebrand shouting in the streets, but a thoughtful and respected leader whose quiet opposition carried immense weight. He believed in boycotting British goods as a form of peaceful protest. If Britain wouldn't listen to their words, perhaps they would feel the economic pressure. The British government eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but they didn't back down. Instead, they doubled down with the Townshend Acts in 1767, which placed taxes on imported goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and, most famously, tea. Once again, the colonies erupted in protest. Boycotts were organized, and merchants in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia agreed not to import British goods. This growing resistance wasn't just happening in the halls of government. It was happening in taverns, in town squares, and on the docks. People were talking, debating, and organizing. TOLs, which had often seen themselves as separate entities, were starting to find a common cause. They were beginning to see themselves not just as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans. The situation grew more tense with each passing year. The Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers fired on a crowd of colonists, sent shockwaves through America. It was a stark and brutal reminder of the military power Britain was willing to use to enforce its will. Although most of the Townshend Acts were repealed, the tax on tea remained a symbol of Parliament's insistence that it had the right to tax the colonies. This led to one of the most iconic acts of defiance in American history, the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships and dumped an entire shipment of tea into the harbor. This wasn't just a protest. It was a direct and deliberate act of rebellion. How did Britain respond? Not with compromise, but with punishment. They passed a series of laws known as the Coercive Acts, or, as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, restricted town meetings in Massachusetts, and gave more power to the royal governor. It was a declaration that Britain would crush the resistance. For Washington and many others, this was the final straw. The punishment of Massachusetts was seen as an attack on all the colonies. If Britain could do this to one, they could do it to any of them. The time for letters and boycotts was rapidly coming to an end. The quiet planter from Mount Vernon was being pushed closer and closer to the forefront of a continental crisis. In response to the Intolerable Acts, the colonies decided to convene a Continental Congress. In 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. And who was one of the delegates from Virginia? George Washington. His presence signaled the seriousness of the moment. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a leader, ready to stand with his fellow colonists against what he now saw as tyranny. At the Congress, Washington was known more for his quiet, commanding presence than for his speeches. He listened intently, offered sound judgment in committees, and famously wore his old military uniform. It was a silent but powerful statement. He was ready for what might come next. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances and agreed to a full-scale boycott of British goods. They also agreed to meet again the following year if their demands were not met. As Washington returned to Virginia, the air was thick with anticipation. Militias were being formed and drilled throughout the colonies. Weapons and gunpowder were being stockpiled. The rising tide of discontent was about to become a tidal wave of revolution. The quiet life Washington had hoped for was over. A new chapter was beginning, not just for him, but for the world. He was no longer just a Virginian planter. He was on the path to becoming the indispensable man of the American Revolution. And that's where we'll leave it for today. The stage is set, the lines are drawn, and the first shots are about to be fired. Join us next time as we dive into the outbreak of war and Washington's appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue the journey, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. We'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our series on the life of George Washington. Today, we're diving into Chapter 6, Called to Lead. It is 1775, and the winds of change are blowing fiercely across the American colonies. The simmering tensions have finally boiled over. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord still echo in the minds of every colonist. A stark declaration that the conflict with Great Britain has moved beyond protest and into open warfare. TOLS, once separate entities with their own interests, are now bound by a common cause, the fight for liberty. In the midst of this escalating crisis, delegates from the 13 colonies gather in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. Mood is a mix of apprehension and resolve. They face a monumental task: to organize a scattered collection of colonial militias into a cohesive fighting force, an army capable of standing against the most powerful military machine in the world, the British Empire. The question on everyone's lips is not just how to fight, but who will lead them in this perilous endeavor. The fate of the burgeoning revolution hangs precariously in the balance. The delegates know this is no ordinary appointment. They need more than just a general. They need a symbol of unity, a figure who can command respect from New England to Georgia, a leader who embodies the very ideals they are fighting for. The choice must be strategic, political, and deeply personal. It requires a man of unshakable character, proven military experience, and unwavering commitment to the cause. As they deliberate, one name begins to surface with increasing frequency. A man whose presence in the chamber, clad in his Virginia militia uniform, is a silent but powerful statement of readiness. That man, of course, is George Washington. At 43 years old, he is a towering figure, both literally and figuratively. His experience during the French and Indian War, while not without its setbacks, has given him invaluable insight into the realities of frontier warfare and the challenges of commanding American troops. He understands the terrain, the people, and, most importantly, the might of the enemy he would face. John Adams, a passionate advocate for independence from Massachusetts, sees in Washington the perfect candidate to unite the colonies. A Virginian leading an army largely composed of New Englanders would be a powerful gesture of colonial solidarity, bridging the regional divides that threatened to fracture their fragile alliance. On June 15, 1775, the Continental Congress makes its historic decision. George Washington is unanimously appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Continental Army. Imagine the weight of that moment. The hopes and fears of 3 million people are suddenly placed upon his shoulders. This isn't a promotion he sought or a position he coveted. In fact, Washington is deeply aware of the immense burden and the personal sacrifice this command entails. He knows the path ahead will be fraught with hardship, uncertainty, and the very real possibility of failure, which would mean not just defeat, but a traitor's death. The next day, Washington stands before the Congress to formally accept the position. His speech is a model of humility and solemn duty. He doesn't speak of glory or conquest. Instead, he speaks of his own consciousness of my own imperfections. He tells the delegates, "I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with the utmost sincerity. I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with. It's a moment of profound gravity. He understands the stakes better than anyone. He is pledging his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor to a cause that is, at this point, little more than a desperate gamble. In a remarkable gesture, Washington also refuses any salary for his service. He asks only that Congress cover his expenses, meticulously documented throughout the war. This act speaks volumes about his character. It's not about personal gain or ambition. It's about selfless service to a cause he believes in. He is not a warlord or a king. He is a citizen soldier, stepping forward in his nation's hour of need. This decision immediately cements his reputation as a leader of unimpeachable integrity, earning him the trust and admiration of the very people he is about to lead into battle. As Washington prepares to leave Philadelphia for Boston, where the siege against the British is already underway, he is leaving behind everything he holds dear. He's leaving his beloved home, Mount Vernon, his wife Martha, and the quiet life of a planter he cherished. He writes to Martha, expressing his unhappiness at the call of duty that tears him away from her. He doesn't know when, or even if, he will ever return. This is the human side of the hero, the personal cost of leadership that is often overlooked in the grand narratives of history. His journey north is not just a trip, it's a transformation. With every mile, George Washington, the Virginia planter, becomes General Washington, the commander of a fledgling army, and the living embodiment of the American Revolution. He is no longer just a delegate or a colonel. He is the central pillar upon which the entire military effort will rest. The challenge ahead is staggering. He must forge an army from farmers, merchants, and blacksmiths, many of whom have never fired a gun in anger. He must find a way to feed, clothe, and equip them with virtually no established supply chain or treasury. He faces a professional, well-disciplined British army, backed by the full resources of a global empire. He must navigate the complex and often frustrating politics of the Continental Congress, begging for resources while trying to execute a coherent military strategy. It's a task that would break most men. But Washington possesses a unique combination of resilience, determination, and an unwavering belief in the righteousness of the American cause. He understands that his primary role is not just to win battles, but to keep the army and the revolution itself alive. His leadership will be tested by brutal winters, devastating defeats, political intrigue, and moments of utter despair. This solemn acceptance of command in 1775 is the turning point. It is the moment when a reluctant leader steps into the crucible of war, called by his country to lead a desperate fight for freedom. It is the beginning of an 8-year ordeal that will shape not only his own destiny, but the destiny of a new nation. Washington's journey to the command of the Continental Army is a powerful story of duty, sacrifice, and the quiet courage of a man who accepted an impossible task because he knew that the future of liberty depended on it. Thank you for joining us for this chapter. The story of Washington's leadership is just beginning, and the trials he faces will be immense. If you found this chapter enlightening, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss what happens next. Hit that notification bell, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we saw the birth of the Continental Army and the appointment of George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Today, we dive into Chapter 7. The struggle begins where Washington faces his first monumental challenge. The Siege of Boston. Imagine the scene. It's the summer of 1775. The smoke from Bunker Hill has barely cleared, and a sprawling, disorganized collection of colonial militia camps surrounds the city of Boston. Inside the city, thousands of British regulars, the most formidable army in the world, are bottled up, but they are well supplied and highly trained. Outside, the American forces are a chaotic mix of farmers, artisans, and merchants from different colonies, united by a cause but lacking discipline, supplies, and a cohesive command structure. This was the powder keg George Washington inherited when he rode into Cambridge, Massachusetts, on Holy Tercera Day. His task was nothing short of monumental. He had to transform this passionate, yet unruly, mob into a fighting force capable of standing against the British Empire. This wasn't just about strategy. It was about nation building in the mud and grit of a military encampment. Washington's first impression was one of dismay. He saw men coming and going as they pleased, officers elected by their own troops, and a critical shortage of everything from gunpowder to proper sanitation. He wrote, "The abuses in this army, I fear, are considerable, and the new modeling of it, in the face of an enemy, is a work of great difficulty and danger." Washington immediately set to work. He was a force of nature, riding through the camps from dawn till dusk. His first order of business was discipline. He established a clear chain of command, replacing the informal, democratic election of officers with a more professional, merit-based system. He implemented strict regulations, standardizing everything from daily drills to camp hygiene. Sentries who fell asleep on duty faced harsh punishment, a stark message that this was no longer a weekend militia. This was a professional army in the making, and the standards would be unflinching. But imposing discipline on fiercely independent-minded colonists was a delicate dance. These men saw themselves as free citizens, not professional soldiers. Washington, a Virginian aristocrat, had to earn the trust of these New Englanders who were often suspicious of outsiders. He did this by leading from the front. He shared their hardships. He listened to their concerns, and he demonstrated an unwavering commitment to the cause that resonated deeply with the rank-and-file. He wasn't just a general. He was the embodiment of their shared struggle. While Washington was building his army, the strategic situation remained a stalemate. The British couldn't break out of Boston, and the Americans didn't have the heavy artillery to force them out. The siege dragged on through the autumn and into the harsh New England winter. Morale was a constant battle. The initial patriotic fervor began to wane as soldiers faced freezing temperatures, inadequate food, and rampant disease. Smallpox was a particularly terrifying threat, a silent enemy that could cripple the army more effectively than any British musket. Furthermore, enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year. Washington faced the very real prospect of his army simply dissolving and walking home. He pleaded with Congress for support and appealed directly to his men, urging them to stay, to believe in the cause, and to see the fight through. It was a testament to his leadership that, while many did leave, a core group remained, forming the backbone of the new Continental Army. He was holding it all together through sheer force of will. The turning point came from a bold and audacious plan conceived by a 25-year-old bookseller-turned-officer named Henry Knox. Knox proposed a seemingly impossible mission: to travel 300 miles to the captured Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, retrieve the heavy cannons and mortar captured there, and haul them back to Boston through the snow and ice of a brutal winter. Washington, recognizing the desperate need for artillery and the daring of the plan, gave Knox his blessing. Knox's noble train of artillery is a story of incredible determination. Using oxen, sleds, and sheer manpower, his team dragged nearly 60 tons of cannons across frozen rivers, through dense forests, and over the Berkshire Mountains. It was a logistical miracle, an epic feat of engineering and endurance that defies belief even today. For weeks, Washington and the army waited, their hopes pinned on Knox's success. Finally, in late January 1776, Knox and his train arrived. The sight of those massive guns rolling into the American camp must have been an incredible boost to morale. Washington now had the tools he needed to break the stalemate, but he had to be smart. A frontal assault on the fortified city of Boston would be suicidal. Instead, he devised a brilliant strategic move. Under the cover of darkness, on the night of March 4th, he ordered his men to secretly fortify Dorchester Heights, a series of hills overlooking the city and the harbor where the British fleet was anchored. The British awoke the next morning to a shocking sight. Overnight, a formidable fortress had appeared on the heights, bristling with the very cannons they had lost at Ticonderoga. General William Howe, the British commander, is said to have exclaimed, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." He knew his position was now untenable. The American guns on Dorchester Heights could bombard both the city and his ships at will. Howe initially planned to assault the heights, but a convenient storm prevented the attack, giving both sides time to reconsider. Facing annihilation, Howe made the only logical choice: He agreed to evacuate Boston on the condition that the Americans would not fire upon his departing fleet. On March 17, 1776, the British ships, loaded with soldiers and loyalist civilians, sailed out of Boston Harbor. The 11-month siege was over. For Washington and the Continental Army, it was a staggering victory. They had forced the world's greatest military power to retreat without firing a single shot in the final engagement. The news electrified the colonies, providing a massive boost to the Patriot cause and solidifying Washington's reputation as a capable and brilliant commander. He had taken a disorganized militia and, through leadership, discipline, and a daring strategic gamble, had forged them into an army that won its first major campaign. The siege of Boston was more than just a military victory. It was a psychological one. It proved that the American cause was not a fleeting rebellion, but a serious, organized effort. It demonstrated that, with ingenuity and resolve, they could stand up to the might of the British Empire. But Washington knew this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, and greater struggles lay ahead. The British would return, stronger and more determined than ever. The lessons learned and the army forged in the crucible of Boston would soon be tested in the fires of New York. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story is just getting started, and the challenges for the young nation are about to get even tougher. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Until next time, stay curious. Hey everyone, welcome back to our deep dive into the American Revolution. Last time, we left off with the soaring spirit of '76 and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. There was this incredible sense of optimism, a feeling that victory was just around the corner. But as we'll see in today's chapter, the summer and fall of 1776 would bring a harsh, brutal dose of reality. This is the story of retreat, survival, and the quiet resilience that would ultimately save the revolution from an early and disastrous end. The ink on the Declaration was barely dry when the full might of the British Empire descended upon New York City. King George III wasn't just going to let the colonies go. He sent the largest expeditionary force of the 18th century. Imagine standing on the shores of Long Island and seeing a forest of masts appear on the horizon. Over 400 ships carrying more than 32,000 professional soldiers, including thousands of feared Hessian mercenaries from Germany. It was a terrifying display of power, meant to crush the rebellion in one swift, decisive blow. Facing this juggernaut was George Washington and his fledgling Continental Army. Now, his army was full of spirit, no doubt about it. These were men who believed in the cause, but they were mostly farmers, merchants, and artisans, not professional soldiers. They were poorly equipped, lacked training, and had very little experience in the kind of large-scale European-style warfare the British were about to unleash. Washington knew he was at a massive disadvantage. His army was smaller, less experienced, and outgunned in every conceivable way. The stage was set for a dramatic and, frankly, desperate confrontation. The first major clash came in late August 1776 with the Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. It was an absolute disaster for the Americans. The British, under General William Howe, executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, completely outsmarting and overwhelming the American defenders. The Continental Army was routed. Men were captured. They panicked. They fled. It was a chaotic, bloody defeat. The American dream seemed to be turning into a nightmare before it had even truly begun. Trapped on Brooklyn Heights, with the British Army in front of them, and the East River behind them, Washington and his army faced annihilation. Capture seemed inevitable. This was the first great test of Washington's leadership, and what he did next was nothing short of miraculous. Under the cover of a stormy night and an unusually thick morning fog, Washington organized a daring, silent evacuation. He commandeered every boat he could find and, over the course of a single night, ferried his entire remaining army of 9,000 men across the river to the relative safety of Manhattan. The British woke up the next morning to find the American camp completely empty. It was an audacious escape, but it was just the beginning of a long, painful retreat. The British didn't let up. They pursued Washington's battered army relentlessly. They captured New York City, which would remain a British stronghold for the rest of the war. The Americans were pushed out of Manhattan, then north through Westchester. There were skirmishes and battles along the way, like the Battle of Harlem Heights, which was a small but much-needed morale boost. But the overall picture was bleak. The Continental Army was bleeding soldiers. Enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year, and with constant defeat, who would want to re-enlist? The army was shrinking, morale was plummeting, and supplies were dangerously low. This period, the fall of 1776, was the absolute low point for the revolutionary cause. It looked like the whole thing was about to collapse. Washington was forced into a long, desperate retreat across New Jersey, with the British hot on his heels. His army, which had once numbered over 20,000, had dwindled to just a few thousand ragged, starving, and freezing men. Thomas Paine, who was marching with the army during this retreat, captured the mood perfectly when he wrote the now famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls," and they truly were. So why didn't the British just finish them off? General Howe had several opportunities to crush Washington's weakened army, but he was cautious. He seemed to believe that one more big defeat would be enough to make the Americans surrender, so he moved slowly, consolidating his gains. This caution, which some historians criticize as a missed opportunity for the British, gave Washington the one thing he desperately needed: time. It wasn't about winning battles at this point. It was about pure survival. Washington's genius during this period wasn't in his battlefield tactics, but in his strategic patience. He knew he couldn't win a head-on fight, so he didn't. He ran, he retreated, regrouped, and kept his army alive. He understood that as long as the Continental Army existed, even as a shadow of its former self, the revolution was not over. The army itself was the symbol of the revolution. This series of strategic withdrawals, while looking like a string of humiliating defeats, was actually a masterclass in preservation. By refusing to engage in a decisive battle he knew he would lose, Washington saved the heart of the rebellion. He traded land for time, pulling his forces back, keeping them just out of reach, waiting for an opportunity. He was playing the long game. His goal wasn't to defeat the British Army in 1776. His goal was simply to survive into 1777. As the army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in December, with winter setting in, the situation was as dire as it could possibly be. The soldiers were exhausted, their clothes were in tatters, and many didn't even have shoes. The revolution was on life support. But Washington hadn't given up hope. He was regrouping, planning, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. He knew he needed a victory, a real, tangible victory, to restore faith, inspire new enlistments, and turn the tide of the war. That moment was coming, and it would arrive on a cold Christmas night in a move so bold, so unexpected that it would change everything. And that's where we'll leave it for today. The story of retreat and survival in 1776 is a crucial chapter. It shows us that victory isn't always about glorious charges and battlefield wins. Sometimes it's about the courage to retreat, the wisdom to preserve your strength, and the resilience to endure the darkest of times. Washington's leadership during this period was what held it all together. Thanks so much for joining me for this part of the story. It's a testament to the human spirit. If you're finding this series valuable, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter, where we'll see Washington cross the Delaware and give the revolution the miracle it so desperately needed. See you next time. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American Revolution. Today, we're tackling Chapter 9, The Night of Courage. Crossing the Delaware. If you thought things were looking bleak for the Continental Army before, you're about to witness one of the most audacious and pivotal moments in American history. So grab a warm drink, because we're heading into the freezing cold of December 1776. Picture this. It's late, 1776. The initial patriotic fervor of the summer has faded. General George Washington's army is a shadow of its former self. They've been chased out of New York, forced to retreat across New Jersey, and are now shivering on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. Morale is at an all-time low. The soldiers are exhausted, underfed, and poorly clothed. Many of their enlistments are set to expire at the end of the year. The dream of independence feels like it's slipping away, freezing in the bitter winter wind. The British, confident and comfortable, have set up a series of outposts in New Jersey, including a garrison of Hessian mercenaries in the town of Trenton. They believe the war is all but won. They just need to wait for the river to freeze solid, and then they can march on Philadelphia, the Patriot capital. To most observers, the American cause looked utterly hopeless. But George Washington was not most observers. He knew that desperate times called for desperate measures. A conventional head-and-fight as impossible. His only chance was to do something so unexpected, so daring, that the enemy would never see it coming. He devised a plan, a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. To catch it, he would have to cross the ice-choked Delaware River in the dead of night during a fierce winter storm. On Christmas night, it was a plan that bordered on madness. Many of his own officers thought it was a suicide mission. The risks were immense. If they were spotted, if the boats couldn't make it across, if the storm was too severe, the entire army could be lost. But Washington knew that the greatest risk of all was doing nothing. The revolution itself was on the line. So, on the evening of December 25th, 1776, the operation began. As a brutal northeaster storm descended, bringing freezing rain, sleet, and howling winds, Washington's men started their legendary crossing. These weren't professional sailors in state-of-the-art vessels. They were Marblehead fishermen from Massachusetts, navigating heavy, unwieldy dirambos loaded with soldiers, cannons, and horses. The river was a treacherous obstacle course of floating ice chunks. The men were soaked to the bone, their hands numb, their feet wrapped in rags because their boots had fallen apart. It was a slow, grueling, and perilous journey. The conditions were so bad that two other columns of the Continental Army, meant to cross at different points, were forced to turn back. Only Washington's main force, through sheer grit and determination, managed to make it to the New Jersey shore. They landed hours behind schedule, with the sun already beginning to rise. The element of complete surprise was fading, but there was no turning back. Washington gave the order to march the 9 miles to Trenton. Some of the men's muskets were too wet to fire. The story goes that when an officer reported this, Washington replied, "Then use the bait. The town must be taken." The men marched on, leaving a trail of blood in the snow from their broken, frostbitten feet. They were driven by the leadership of their commander and a desperate, flickering flame of hope. This wasn't just a march. It was a testament to human endurance and the unwavering will to fight for a cause they believed in. When the Continental Army finally descended upon Trenton, they achieved the surprise Washington had gambled everything on. The Haitians, who had been celebrating Christmas and felt secure behind the storm and the river, were caught completely off guard. The battle was swift and decisive. In less than an hour, the Americans had secured a stunning victory. They captured nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers, along with their weapons and supplies, while suffering very few casualties themselves. The Battle of Trenton was not a massive strategic victory in terms of numbers, but its psychological impact was immeasurable. It was the shot in the arm the American Revolution desperately needed. News of the victory at Trenton spread like wildfire. It was a thunderclap that shattered the illusion of British invincibility. Suddenly, there was a reason to believe again. It proved that Washington was a capable and daring leader, and that the Continental Army, even in its weakened state, could win. Soldiers whose enlistments were about to expire were inspired to stay and fight. New recruits began to trickle into the army. The French, who was secretly watching and weighing whether to support the American cause, took notice. This small, brutal battle on a winter morning reignited the dying embers of the revolution and turned them back into a roaring fire. It marked a crucial turning point. The retreat was over. From this night of courage forward, the Americans were back on the offensive. The road to final independence would still be long and hard, but the path had been secured on the icy banks of the Delaware. The crossing of the Delaware and the subsequent victory at Trenton are more than just a chapter in a history book. They are a powerful story of leadership, resilience, and the incredible things people can achieve when pushed to their absolute limit. It shows how one bold move, one night of incredible courage, can change the entire course of history. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We have many more stories to tell. Until next time, Stay curious. Picture this. It's the winter of 1777. The American Revolution is raging. But for the Continental Army, the biggest enemy isn't the British hits. The brutal cold at Valley Forge. Thousands of soldiers, ill-equipped and starving, huddled together in crude huts, battling frostbite, disease, and despair. Many are barefoot in the snow, their spirits as frozen as the ground beneath them. But in the midst of this suffering, one man stands as a beacon of hope. General George Washington. He refuses to abandon his men, sharing in their hardships and tirelessly lobbying for supplies. His unwavering leadership and deep compassion are the glue holding the fragile army together. This isn't just a story of survival. It is the story of how a leader's perseverance forged a nation's spirit in the harshest of winters. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history as moving as I do, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American Revolution. Last time, we left the Continental Army, persevering through incredible hardship. Today, in Chapter 11, we're talking about the moment the tide truly began to turn. This isn't just a story about a new flag. It's about the birth of a new alliance that would reshape the world. Picture this. The American cause, once seen as a fool's errand by the great powers of Europe, suddenly has a heavyweight champion in its corner. After the stunning American victory at Saratoga, France, a longtime rival of Great Britain, saw its moment. They decided to officially recognize the United States and, more importantly, to back their fight for independence with military power. This wasn't just a handful of supplies. We're talking about ships, soldiers, and a flood of financial support. The French alliance transformed a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Suddenly, Britain wasn't just fighting a scrappy group of rebels in North America. They were now facing their old adversary, France, on multiple fronts, stretching their powerful navy and army to their limits. This international dimension was the game-changer George Washington had been praying for. The war was no longer confined to the fields of Pennsylvania or the forests of New York. It was now being fought on the high seas and in colonies across the globe. This forced the British to rethink their entire strategy and divert precious resources away from America. At the heart of this new partnership was an incredible cast of characters, and the bond between George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette stands out as one of history's most remarkable friendships. Lafayette, a young, idealistic French aristocrat, had arrived in America even before the official alliance, fueled by a passion for liberty. He quickly earned Washington's respect and affection, becoming like a son to the American commander. Washington, in turn, saw in Lafayette a brilliant and brave officer, and a vital link to the French support they so desperately needed. Washington now had to master a new skill: coalition warfare. He wasn't just commanding American troops anymore. He was coordinating with French generals like the Comte de Rochambeau and admirals like the Comte de Grasse. This was no easy task. Imagine the challenges: language barriers, different military traditions, and distinct strategic objectives. Washington had to be a general, a diplomat, and a master of logistics all at once. He had to build trust and ensure that the combined Franco-American forces could operate as a single, effective fighting machine. The collaboration between Washington and Rochambeau is a masterclass. In leadership, they held countless councils of war, poring over maps and debating strategy, while Rochambeau commanded a professional, experienced French army. He respected Washington's position as the overall commander in the American theater. This mutual respect was crucial. It allowed them to overcome disagreements and focus on their shared goal: defeating the British. Lafayette was often the bridge between the two, his fluency in both languages and his understanding of both cultures proving invaluable. The arrival of the French was more than just a military boost. It was a profound psychological victory for the Americans. After years of fighting alone, of devastating losses and brutal winters, seeing the white uniforms of the French regulars marching alongside the Continental Army was an incredible morale booster. It was tangible proof that they were not alone, that their cause was just, and that victory was now a real possibility. The new alliance gave the American people and their soldiers renewed hope and the determination to see the fight through to the end. This Franco-American partnership would soon be put to the ultimate test. The focus of the war was shifting south to Virginia. where a large British army under Lord Cornwallis was operating with seeming impunity. Washington and Rochambeau saw an opportunity. It was a daring, incredibly complex plan that would require perfect timing and coordination between their armies on land and the French fleet at sea. The goal: to trap Cornwallis and his entire army. The plan was audacious. It involved marching the bulk of the combined Franco-American army hundreds of miles from New York to Virginia, all while keeping the British commander in New York, Sir Henry Clinton, convinced that they were about to attack him. It was a brilliant campaign of deception. Simultaneously, Admiral de Grasse's French fleet would sail from the Caribbean to block the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any chance of a British naval rescue or escape for Cornwallis. Everything had to work perfectly, and it did. In the late summer of 1781, Washington's and Rochambeau's armies linked up and began their secret march south. The logistics were a nightmare, but the disciplined march was a success. Meanwhile, de Grasse arrived at the Chesapeake and decisively defeated the British fleet that was sent to relieve Cornwallis. The trap was sprung. The combined land and sea operation, a direct result of the French alliance, had successfully cornered one of Britain's finest armies on the Virginia Peninsula. The stage was now set for the final, decisive battle of the American Revolution. The new alliance had completely altered the strategic landscape. What began as a plea for help had blossomed into a powerful military partnership that was about to deliver the war's finishing blow. The collaboration, the friendships, and the shared vision for a different world would all culminate in one place: a small Virginia port town called Yorktown. And that's exactly where we'll pick up next time. Thanks so much for watching. The story is reaching its climax, and you won't want to miss it. If you're enjoying this journey through history, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. See you then. When we think of the American Revolution, what comes to mind? Brave soldiers, muskets firing, and heroic generals on horseback, right? But what if I told you the war was also won in whispers, with invisible ink, and by a secret network so clandestine that its full story wasn't known for over a century? This is a story of George Washington, and the Culper spy ring. In 1778, the Continental Army was on the ropes. After a series of devastating losses, Washington realized he was fighting blind. The British, with their superior numbers and resources, occupied New York City, and he had no reliable way of knowing their plans. He desperately needed intelligence, real, actionable information about troop movements, fortifications, and strategies. He knew that without eyes and ears behind enemy lines, the dream of American independence would likely die. This is where a young cavalry officer named Benjamin Talmadge comes in. Washington tasked Talmadge, a brilliant and trusted aide, with a mission of utmost importance: create a spy network right under the noses of the British in their own stronghold, New York City. This wasn't just about sending a few scouts. This was about building a sophisticated, covert operation capable of delivering consistent, high-level intelligence. Talmadge knew the risks. If caught, his agents would face a swift and brutal execution as spies. He needed people who were not only brave, but also clever, discreet, and deeply committed to the cause. He turned to his childhood friends from Setauket, Long Island, a small town that would become the nerve center of this secret war. The core of the ring was a handful of ordinary citizens leading extraordinary double lives. First, there was Abraham Woodhull, a quiet farmer from using the codename Samuel Culper. Woodhull would travel into British-occupied New York City under the guise of visiting his sister to sell farm goods. While there, he would meticulously observe everything: which regiments were arriving, how many ships were in the harbor, and any chatter he could overhear from soldiers and loyalists. He was the primary information gatherer, the eyes of the operation. But getting that information out of New York was the real challenge. That's where Robert Townsend came in. A well-respected merchant living in Manhattan, Townsend used the alias Samuel Culper, Jr. His position gave him access to British officers and loyalist circles. He could listen to conversations in coffee houses and taverns, gathering intelligence that Woodhull, an outsider, could never access. Townsend was the ears a man who could separate rumor from fact. His notes were the lifeblood of the spy ring. So, how did they get these precious secrets from a lockdown city back to Washington? This is where the ingenuity of the Culper ring truly shines. Townsend would pass his intelligence to a courier, Austin Rowe. Rowe was a tavern owner who made regular 55-mile horseback rides from Sedoquette to New York for supplies. He would hide the messages in plain sight, often within his saddlebags, and gallop back to Long Island, a journey fraught with danger and British patrols. Once back in Sedoquette, Rowe would deliver the message to Abraham Woodhull would then pass it to the next link in the chain, Caleb Brewster. Brewster was a daredevil whaleboat captain who navigated the treacherous Long Island Sound. He would row his small boat across the Sound under the cover of darkness, dodging British warships, to a designated point in Connecticut. There, he would hand off the intelligence to Benjamin Talmadge, who would finally deliver it to General Washington. It was a complex, multi-stage relay race where a single mistake could bring the entire network crashing down. To protect themselves, they developed a brilliant system of codes. Talmadge created a codebook with 763 numbers assigned to different words, names, and places. For example, George Washington was 711, New York was 727, and Abraham Woodhull was 722. This ensured that even if a message was intercepted, it would be gibberish to the British. They also used a sophisticated invisible ink developed by Sir James J., brother of founding father John J. One chemical was used to write the message, which would then disappear. A second chemical, applied by the recipient, would make the writing reappear. This was cutting-edge technology for the time, a layer of security that made their communications nearly impenetrable. And they had dead drops, like a specific spot in a pasture where Rowe could leave a message for Woodhull and signals, like Anna Strong's laundry. Anna Strong, another Sedoquette resident, devised a simple yet ingenious signaling system. She would hang a black petticoat on her clothesline, which was visible to Caleb Brewster out on the Sound. This told him that a message was ready. The number of white handkerchiefs she hung next to it indicated which cove he should land in to meet the courier. A petticoat and some handkerchiefs, a seemingly innocent domestic chore, was actually a vital part of military intelligence. So, did it all work? Absolutely. The Culper ring's intelligence was a game-changer. In 1780, they uncovered a British plan to launch a surprise attack on the French fleet that had just arrived in Newport, Rhode Island to aid the Americans. Washington received the intel from the Culper ring and cleverly devised a fake plan to attack New York City. He made sure this plan fell into British hands. The British, believing New York was about to be assaulted, canceled their attack on the French and recalled their troops to defend the city. The French alliance was saved, thanks to a secret message passed through the hands of a farmer, a merchant, a tavern keeper, and a whaleboat captain. Perhaps their greatest triumph was exposing one of the most infamous traitors in American history, Benedict Arnold. The ring picked up on whispers of a high-ranking American officer colluding with the British. While they didn't get Arnold's name initially, their intelligence put Washington on high alert. When British Major John Andre was captured with incriminating papers hidden in his boot detailing Arnold's plot to surrender West Point, the pieces fell into place. The capture of West Point would have been catastrophic, potentially splitting the colonies in two and ending the war. The Culper ring's early warnings helped thwart a disaster. For years, the identities of these spies remained a closely guarded secret. They never sought fame or recognition. Robert Townsend, Culper Jr., was so terrified of being discovered that he made Washington promise to never reveal his name. A promise kept until his identity was finally uncovered by a historian in 1939. These were ordinary people who risked everything, not for glory, but for the cause of liberty. The story of the Culper spy ring is a powerful reminder that history is often shaped by unseen forces. While generals and armies clashed on the battlefield, the silent work of spies and the intelligence they gather can turn the tide of war. George Washington, the general, was formidable. But George Washington, the spy master, who understood the profound power of information, was truly unbeatable. He outsmarted the most powerful empire on earth, thanks in no small part to a handful of brave patriots and their secret war of whispers. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this secret history as fascinating as I do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories hidden in the pages of the past. See you next time. Welcome, bike history buffs. Last time, we navigated the treacherous middle years of the American Revolution. Today, we're heading south for Chapter 13. The Battle for the South. This wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a brutal, game-changing new phase of the war. So, why the sudden pivot to the South? By 1778, the war in the North had ground to a stalemate. The British, frustrated by their inability to crush Washington's army, devised a new strategy. They believed the southern colonies were teeming with loyalists, just waiting for the Crown's support to rise up and restore royal authority. They saw the South, with its valuable cash crops like tobacco and rice, as the soft underbelly of the rebellion. Capture the South, te reasoned, and the North would eventually wither and fall. Their plan kicked off with a bang. In late 1778, the British captured Savannah, Georgia, with relative ease. This early victory seemed to confirm their assumptions. By 1780, they had their sights set on a much bigger prize, Charleston, South Carolina, the most important city in the region. The siege of Charleston was a disaster for the Americans. In May 1780, General Benjamin Lincoln was forced to surrender his entire army of over 5,000 men. This was the single largest defeat for the Continental Army in the entire war. The loss was catastrophic, not just in terms of manpower and supplies, but for morale. It looked like the British Southern strategy was an overwhelming success, and the American cause was on the brink of collapse. With South Carolina seemingly under their control, the British, under the command of Lord Cornwallis, set out to pacify the rest of the region. But they made a critical miscalculation. Their methods were often brutal, alienating the very people they hoped to win over. Instead of a wave of loyalist support, they ignited a fierce, partisan-style resistance. The southern backcountry erupted into a savage civil war. This wasn't a war of neat battle lines and uniformed armies. It was a war of ambushes, raids, and skirmishes, fought in swamps, forests, and farms. Legendary figures like Francis Marion, Neeknam Day, the Swamp Fox, and Thomas Sumter, the Carolina Gamecock, led small, agile bands of militia. They harassed British supply lines, attacked outposts, and then vanished back into the landscape. They couldn't defeat the British Army in a head-on fight, but they could bleed it, exhaust it, and prevent it from ever truly controlling the territory. Meanwhile, a more formal American response was taking shape. The Continental Congress initially sent Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, to lead the Southern Army, but his command ended in another crushing defeat at the Battle of Camden in August 1780. Gates's army was routed, and he himself fled the battlefield in disgrace. The situation looked bleaker than ever. This is where George Washington made one of the most brilliant decisions of his military career. He knew the South needed a different kind of leader. It needed someone who was not just a general, but a strategist, an organizer, and a master of logistics. Et chose, Nathaniel Greene. Greene, a self-taught Quaker from Rhode Island, was arguably Washington's most capable subordinate. When he arrived in the South in December 1780, he found what he described as a shadow of an army. They were poorly fed, poorly equipped, and shattered in spirit. He had to rebuild everything from scratch. Greene's strategy was unconventional and utterly genius. He knew he couldn't beat Cornwallis in a major winner-to-call battle. His army was simply too weak. So, he decided not to play by the British rules. He famously declared, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." His plan was to divide his small force, forcing Cornwallis to divide his own and lead the British on a grueling chase across the Carolinas. He sent one part of his army under the command of the brilliant Daniel Morgan. This led to a stunning American victory at the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781. Morgan used a clever tactical plan, deploying his militia in a way that played to their strengths and weaknesses, luring the British into a devastating trap. Cowpens was a tactical masterpiece and a huge morale boost for the Americans. An enraged Cornwallis abandoned his baggage and began a frantic pursuit of Greene's army, determined to destroy it. This was exactly what Greene wanted. He led Cornwallis on a race to the Dan, a desperate retreat across North Carolina to the Dan River on the Virginia border. Greene's men were exhausted and starving, but their commander's skill at logistics and his sheer determination kept them just ahead of the British. After crossing the Dan River and receiving reinforcements, Greene turned back to confront Cornwallis. The two armies finally clashed at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781. Tactically, it was a British victory. Greene was forced to retreat from the field, but the cost for the British was immense. 1/4 of Cornwallis's army was killed or wounded. As one British politician later remarked, another such victory would ruin the British army. This is the core of Greene's strategy. He was willing to lose battles to win the campaign. He wore down Cornwallis's professional army, drawing them further and further from their supply bases on the coast. He might have lost the field at Guilford Courthouse, but he had savaged the British army. Cornwallis, unable to sustain his campaign in the Carolinas, made a fateful decision. He marched his weary army north into Virginia, hoping to cut off the rebellion at its source. This move set the stage for the final act of the war. While Greene continued to methodically recapture British outposts in the Carolinas, Cornwallis was setting his own trap. By moving to Virginia, he put himself in a position where he could be cornered by the combined forces of Washington's army and our crucial allies, the French. Washington, who had been coordinating this entire continental strategy, saw his opportunity. He orchestrated a masterful deception, making the British think he was going to attack New York. Instead, he marched his army and the French forces under Rochambeau hundreds of miles south to Virginia. The French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse, sailed to the Chesapeake Bay, sealing off any escape by sea for Cornwallis. Cornered at a small tobacco port called Yorktown, Cornwallis found himself trapped. The combined American and French armies laid siege to his position. Outnumbered and with no hope of reinforcement or escape, he had no choice. On October 19, 1781, Lord Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. The battle for the South, which began as a British attempt to break the rebellion, had ended up breaking the back of the British war effort. The brilliant, grinding campaign led by Nathaniel Greene, the fierce resistance of the Southern partisans, and Washington's masterful strategic coordination had led directly to the decisive victory at Yorktown. The war wasn't officially over, but for all intents and purposes, American independence had been won. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the Southern campaign. It's a story of resilience, strategy, and how a seemingly defeated cause can rise to achieve victory. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. See you next time. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Today, we're diving into one of the most pivotal moments in American history, the event that essentially sealed the deal for independence, the victory at York. Grab your popcorn, because this story has all the drama, strategy, and triumph of a Hollywood blockbuster. So, let's set the stage. The year is 1781. The war has been raging for 6 long, grueling years. Both the Continental Army and the British forces are exhausted, resources are stretched thin, and the outcome is still hanging in the balance. The British, under the command of Lieutenant General Lord Charles Cornwallis, had been campaigning in the southern colonies. They believed that by controlling the South, they could crush the rebellion from the ground up. Cornwallis had seen some success, but it came at a high cost. His army was weary, and he needed a place to rest, resupply, and wait for reinforcements from the British Navy. He chose a small tobacco port on the coast of Virginia, Yorktown. He fortified his position on the peninsula, confident in the strength of the Royal Navy to protect his flank and bring him the men and supplies he needed. From his perspective, it was a logical, defensible position. But this decision, which seemed so sound at the time, would prove to be one of the greatest military blunders in British history. Meanwhile, General George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, was up north, near New York City. He was initially planning a major attack on the British stronghold there, alongside his French allies. Led by the Comte de Roche, the French had been absolutely crucial to the American cause, providing not just soldiers, but also naval power and financial support. Without them, the war would have likely been lost long before. But then, a game-changing piece of intelligence arrived. Washington received a dispatch that a massive French fleet, under the command of Admiral de Grasse, was sailing from the West Indies not to New York, but to the Chesapeake Bay, right at the doorstep of Yorktown. This was the moment, the opportunity Washington had been waiting for, a chance to trap Cornwallis's entire army. This is where Washington's genius as a commander truly shines. He had to make a bold, high-risk decision. Abandon the plan for New York and march his combined American and French forces over 400 miles south to Virginia. It was a monumental logistical challenge. They had to move thousands of troops, artillery, and supplies, all while keeping their true destination a secret from the British in New York. If the British figured out what was happening, they could intercept them or attack Washington's rear. So, they engaged in a brilliant campaign of deception. Washington had his men build huge brick ovens, visible to the British, creating the illusion that they were preparing for a long siege of New York. They sent out fake dispatches with false plans, knowing some would be captured. The British commander in New York, Sir Henry Clinton, completely bought the ruse. He was convinced New York was the target and stayed put, waiting for an attack that would never come. As Clinton waited, Washington and Rochambeau were on the move. Their combined army embarked on an epic march south. It was a spectacle to behold the Continental soldiers in their ragged uniforms marching alongside the French troops in their pristine white ones. It was a symbol of two worlds, colliding for a common cause. The march itself was an incredible feat of endurance and coordination. They covered hundreds of miles in just a few weeks, a blistering pace for an army of that size in the 18th century. By late September 1781, all the pieces were in place. The trap was set. First, Admiral de Grasse's fleet arrived in the Chesapeake Bay. They engaged the British naval squadron that was sent to relieve Cornwallis in a decisive battle known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. The French were victorious, driving off the British ships. This was the critical blow. The Royal Navy, the most powerful navy in the world, had been repelled. Cornwallis was now completely cut off from escape or reinforcement by sea. He was trapped on the Yorktown Peninsula. Soon after, Washington and Rochambeau's armies arrived and linked up with another American force led by the Marquis de Lafayette, who had been shadowing Cornwallis in Virginia for months. The Allies methodically and systematically closed the ring around the British. Under the direction of French engineering experts, they began digging a series of trenches, known as parallels. This was classic siege warfare. The first trench was dug about 800 yards from the British lines. From there, they could safely bring up their heavy artillery, massive cannons, and mortar. On October 9th, the bombardment began. The sky erupted with fire and smoke. 4 days, a relentless barrage of cannonballs rained down on the British positions. One American soldier wrote that the bombs and cannonballs were flying so thick that they were like a shower of hail. The Allied guns were so effective they were knocking out the British artillery one by one. Life inside the British lines became a living nightmare. There was nowhere to hide. Buildings were leveled, defenses crumbled, and casualties mounted daily. To tighten the noose even further, the Allies needed to advance their trenches closer. But two key British defensive positions, known as Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, stood in their way. On the night of October 14th, Washington ordered a daring nighttime assault. The attack was carried out in 2 columns. The French, under the command of the Baron de Viomenil, stormed Redoubt 9. The Americans, led by the young and ambitious Alexander Hamilton, charged Redoubt 10. To ensure speed and surprise, the soldiers advanced with unloaded muskets, relying solely on the bayonet. It was a terrifying, hand-to-hand fight in the dark. But in less than 30 minutes, both redoubts were captured. It was an incredible display of courage and a major psychological blow to the British. With these positions taken, the Allies could now dig their second parallel trench, just 400 yards from the main British line. The end was near. Cornwallis was desperate. He saw his situation was hopeless. He made one last, frantic attempt to escape. His plan was to ferry his troops across the York River to Gloucester Point under the cover of darkness, and then try to fight his way north to New York. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. The first wave of troops made it across, but then a violent storm suddenly blew in, scattering the boats and making any further crossing impossible. It was as if the very elements were conspiring against him. The escape attempt failed. Defeated, and with no hope left, Cornwallis had no choice but to face the inevitable. On the morning of October 17, 1781, a lone British drummer boy appeared on the ramparts, beating a call for a parley. A British officer followed, waving a white handkerchief. The booming cannons fell silent. Cornwallis requested a ceasefire to negotiate terms of surrender. 2 days later, on October 19th, the formal surrender took place. Thousands of American and French soldiers lined the road to Yorktown, forming a human corridor over a mile long. The defeated British Army marched out from their defenses. In a final act of petulance, Lord Cornwallis claimed to be ill and sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, to surrender his sword in his place. O'Hara first tried to surrender to the French commander, Rochambeau, but Rochambeau, recognizing the proper protocol, directed him to General Washington. Washington, in turn, upholding military etiquette, refused to accept the surrender from a subordinate and directed O'Hara to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. As the British soldiers laid down their arms, their band is said to have played a fitting tune. The world turned upside down. And indeed, it had. A group of colonial rebels, with the help of their French allies, had defeated the most powerful military empire on earth. When news of the surrender at Yorktown reached London, it sent shockwaves through the British government. Prime Minister Lord North, upon hearing the news, reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." And he was right. While the peace treaty wouldn't be officially signed for another 2 years, the victory at Yorktown effectively ended the American Revolutionary War. It broke the will of the British to continue fighting. It secured American independence and set the stage for the birth of a new nation, the United States of America. The siege of Yorktown was a masterpiece of military strategy, international cooperation, and sheer determination. It was the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice, a final, decisive victory that turned the dream of independence into a reality. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the Battle of Yorktown. It's a story that never fails to inspire. If you found this video interesting and learned something new, please give it a thumbs up. And do you not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter in history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we arrive at a moment that is not a battle, not a political debate, but a simple, profound act that would define the very character of a new nation. This is Chapter 15, The General's Farewell. The year is 1783. The smoke has cleared from the battlefields of the Revolution. The Treaty of Paris has been signed. America, against all odds, is free. The Continental Army, a patchwork of farmers, merchants, and artisans, forged into a fighting force by sheer will, had achieved the impossible. Their leader, General George Washington, was the most powerful and revered man on the continent. Victory was his. The army was loyal to him. The future was in his hands, and what he did next shocked the world. Imagine the scene, December 4th, 1783, at Fraunces Tavern in New York City. The air is thick with emotion. Washington has gathered his officers, his brothers in arms, for a final goodbye. These are the men who had weathered the freezing winters at Valley Forge, who had crossed the treacherous Delaware, who'd shared in every hardship and every triumph. He raises a glass. His voice, usually so steady and commanding, is heavy with feeling, with a heart full of love and gratitude. He begins, "I now take leave of you." He can barely speak through his own tears. "I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." One by one, he embraces each officer, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of their shared sacrifice. There are no grand speeches, no boasts of victory, just the raw, human emotion of a leader parting with his men. This wasn't a general dismissing his subordinates. It was a father bidding farewell to his sons. But this emotional farewell was just the prelude. The main event, the act that would echo through the ages, was yet to come. On December 23rd, Washington traveled to Annapolis, Maryland, where the Continental Congress was assembled. He was there to perform one final duty, to resign his commission as Commander-in-Chief. Now, let's pause and understand the gravity of this moment. Throughout history, victorious generals did not simply go home. They seized power. They became kings, emperors, or dictators. Look at Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, or, later, Napoleon Bonaparte. Power, once gained, is rarely relinquished voluntarily. The world, especially the crowned heads of Europe, watched and waited, expecting Washington to do the same. They assumed he would declare himself King George I of America. King George III himself was reported to have said that if Washington gave up his power, he would be the greatest man in the world. And that is exactly what Washington did. He walked into the Maryland State House, not as a conqueror, but as a citizen. He stood before the assembled delegates of Congress, everybody that had appointed him on, delivered a short, humble address. He spoke of the army, of the divine guidance that had seen them through, and then he uttered the words that would cement his legacy. Having now finished the work assigned to me, he said, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life. With that, he handed his commission papers to the President of Congress. It was a simple piece of parchment, but it symbolized the bedrock principle of the new American Republic. That military power must be subordinate to civilian authority. The man who could have been a king chose to be a citizen. He was returning to his farm at Mount Vernon, to live as the legendary Roman general who saved Rome and then returned to his plow. This single act was perhaps Washington's greatest contribution to the nation. It wasn't a military victory, but a moral one. It established a precedent of peaceful transfer of power that has been the hallmark of American democracy ever since. He demonstrated that in this new form of government, leadership was a temporary trust, not a permanent possession. Power was something to be held in service to the people, not over them. His resignation sent a powerful message across the globe. It declared that America was different. It would not be another monarchy or military dictatorship. It would be a republic, governed by laws and a constitution, not by the whim of a single powerful man. It was a radical idea, and Washington's action was the living proof of its sincerity. In giving up his power, Washington gained something far greater: immortal honor. He secured his place, not just as a brilliant general, but as the embodiment of civic virtue. He showed that true greatness lies not in how much power one can accumulate, but in one's willingness to lay it down for the greater good. This moment, this quiet, dignified farewell, is the true culmination of the American Revolution. It was the final, definitive statement that the fight had not been to replace one king with another, but to create a nation where the people were sovereign. Washington's humble departure from the stage of power ensured that the republic he had fought so hard to create would have a chance to survive and flourish. It was, in every sense, his final and most important victory. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of George Washington, the farmer who became a general and then chose to become a farmer again, is a powerful reminder of the values this nation was built upon. If you found this story as moving as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter in this incredible American story. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're journeying back to a critical, yet often overlooked, period in American history. We've just won the revolution, the fireworks have faded, and the cheering has stopped. But what comes next? Imagine this. You've successfully thrown off the shackles of a powerful king, only to find yourselves adrift in a sea of chaos. That's precisely the situation the newly independent United States found itself in during the 1780s. This is the story of a nation in desperate need of direction, a time when the dream of liberty nearly crumbled into a nightmare of disorder. The initial plan for governing this new nation was a document called the Articles of Confederation. Now, you have to understand the mindset of the people at the time. They had just fought a long, bloody war against a powerful, centralized government in Britain. The last thing they wanted was to create another one. So, they designed the Articles to be intentionally weak. It created a league of friendship among the states, not a unified nation. The central government, Sukasitwas, had very limited powers. It could declare war, make treaties, and manage a post office, but that was about it. Think about what it couldn't do. The Confederation Congress had no power to tax. None. If it needed money to pay back the massive war debts or to fund the army, it had to go, hat in hand, to the individual states and ask for contributions. And as you can imagine, the states were often reluctant to pay up. Why should Virginia pay for something that benefits Massachusetts? This created a huge problem. The government was broke. Soldiers who had risked their lives for independence weren't getting paid. The nation's credit was in shambles, and foreign countries like Britain and Spain looked on with amusement, waiting for the American experiment to fail. Furthermore, the central government had no power to regulate interstate commerce. This led to absolute economic chaos. New York would put tariffs on goods coming in from New Jersey. Connecticut would retaliate against Massachusetts. Each state acted like its own little country, with its own economic interests. It was like having 13 different drivers all trying to steer the same car, each pulling the wheel in a different direction. This economic warfare between the states stifled growth, hurt merchants and farmers, and made it impossible to build a cohesive national economy. The dream of a prosperous new nation was being choked by internal squabbles. There was also no national judiciary, no Supreme Court. If citizens of different states had a legal dispute, there was no neutral federal authority to resolve it. And perhaps most critically, there was no single executive leader, no president. There was a president of the United States in Congress assembled, but this was just a presiding officer for a year, not a leader with any real authority. Essentially, there was no one in charge, no one to enforce the laws that Congress did manage to pass. Laws were suggestions, not commands. The government was all bark and no bite. The weakness of the Articles became terrifyingly clear during an event known as Shays' Rebellion in 1786. In western Massachusetts, farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, were losing their farms to debt and high taxes. They had fought for liberty, only to return home to face financial ruin. Led by a former Continental Army captain, Daniel Shays, these frustrated farmers rose up. They shut down courts to prevent foreclosures and demanded debt relief. The national government was powerless to intervene. It had no money and no army to send. Massachusetts had to raise its own private militia to put down the rebellion. This event sent shockwaves across the country. Leaders like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison were horrified. If the government couldn't even maintain basic law and order and protect property, what was the point of it all? Shays' Rebellion was the final wake-up call. It proved to everyone that the Articles of Confederation were not just ineffective, they were dangerous. The nation was on the brink of anarchy. It was out of this crisis, this national emergency, that the call for change grew louder. People realized that their fear of a strong central government had led them to create one that was too weak to function. They needed something more. They needed a government with the power to tax, to regulate trade, to enforce laws, and to protect the nation, but one that also protected the liberties they had fought so hard to win. This growing consensus set the stage for one of the most remarkable events in political history, the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The nation, having stared into the abyss of failure, was about to get a second chance to get it right. And that's where we'll pick up next time, exploring the debates, the compromises, and the brilliant minds that came together in Philadelphia to forge the United States Constitution, the very framework of government we live under today. It is a fascinating story of how a nation in need found its footing and created a lasting republic. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into post-revolutionary America interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'll see you then. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we re-diving into one of the most pivotal moments in American history, the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Imagine this. It is a hot, humid summer in Philadelphia. The brand new United States is struggling. The Articles of Confederation, the country's first attempt at a government, just aren't working. The nation is weak, in debt, and on the brink of chaos. Something has to change, and fast. So, the brightest minds from across the states are called to Philadelphia. Their initial mission, to simply revise the failing articles, but a few key figures had a much bolder, more radical idea in mind. They weren't there to patch up an old system. They were there to build a new one from the ground up. This gathering would become known as the Constitutional Convention. And who do they call upon to lead this monumental task? To lend it an air of unmatched authority and seriousness. None other than the hero of the Revolution himself, George Washington. Washington's presence was absolutely critical. He had retired to his beloved Mount Vernon, hoping for a quiet life after the war. But when his country called, he answered. His decision to preside over the convention gave it immediate legitimacy. People trusted Washington. His integrity was unquestionable. If he was involved, it must be for the good of the nation. So, with Washington steering the ship, delegates from 12 of the 13 states Rhode Island sat this one outgathered inside the Pennsylvania State House, the very same room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed just 11 years earlier. The doors were locked, the windows were shut tight against the summer heat and prying ears, and a vow of secrecy was taken. What happened inside that room was meant for their ears only. They knew that the debates would be fierce, and public opinion could derail the entire process before it even started. The delegates were a who's who of the founding generation. The brilliant and meticulous James Madison, the eloquent Gouverneur Maurice, the wise and aging Benjamin Franklin, and the ambitious Alexander Hamilton, just to name a few. Each man brought his own ideas, his own interests, and his own vision for what America should be. The central debate quickly became clear. How do you create a government that is strong enough to be effective, but not so strong that it tramples on the rights of the people? This was the ultimate balancing act. They were haunted by the memory of King George III's tyranny, but they were also terrified by the anarchy and weakness they saw under the Articles of Confederation. The discussions were intense, passionate, and often heated. For 4 long months, they debated, they argued, and they compromised. One of the first major hurdles was the issue of representation. The larger states, like Virginia, wanted representation in the new legislature to be based on population. Naturally, this would give them more power. The smaller states, like New Jersey, were terrified of being overpowered and insisted on equal representation for every state, regardless of its size. The convention almost fell apart over this issue. It was a complete deadlock. But then came the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise. Roger Sherman proposed a 2-house legislature, a House of Representatives, where representation would be based on population, pleasing the large states, and a Senate, where each state would have 2 senators, satisfying the small states. It was a brilliant solution that saved the convention and shaped the U.S. Congress as we know it today. But the compromises didn't stop there. The next major, and far more troubling, issue was slavery. The southern states wanted to count their enslaved population for the purpose of representation, which would give them more power in the House. The northern states, many of which were moving toward abolition, were horrified by this idea. They argued that if enslaved people were considered property, they shouldn't be counted for representation at all. This led to the deeply controversial 3/5 compromise. The delegates agreed to count 3/5 of the enslaved population for both representation and taxation. It was a dark, pragmatic bargain made to keep the southern states in the Union, and it embedded a terrible contradiction into the heart of a nation founded on liberty. They also debated the power of the president. How should the executive be chosen? How long should they serve? What powers should they have? Some feared a single executive would look too much like a king. Others argued that a strong, decisive leader was necessary to guide the country. They eventually settled on a single president, elected not by popular vote, but by an electoral college, to serve a 4-year term. They created a system of checks and balances, separating power between 3 branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, to ensure no single branch could become too dominant. This ingenious structure was designed to protect liberty by making power check power. Finally, after months of grueling debate, a document began to take shape. Gouverneur Maurice, known for his powerful writing, was tasked with putting all the agreements and compromises into their final form. He drafted the preamble, those famous and immortal words, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. To ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. It was a radical shift. This wasn't a treaty between states anymore. It was a government created by we the people. On September 17, 1787, the final draft of the Constitution was signed by 39 of the 55 delegates who had attended. It was a moment of both triumph and uncertainty. Benjamin Franklin, as he watched George Washington sign the document, famously commented on the sun carved into the back of Washington's chair. He said that painters often found it difficult to distinguish a rising sun from a setting sun. "I have," he said, often and often in the course of the session, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. The creation of the Constitution in Philadelphia was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. The document now had to be ratified, or approved, by T states. This would set off another round of furious debate across the country between the Federalists, who supported the new Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who feared it, gave the central government too much power. But the work done in that hot, secret room in Philadelphia laid the foundation for a new form of governor republic that has now endured for over 2 centuries. It was a miracle of compromise and a testament to the idea that people with deep disagreements could come together to create something lasting and profound for the common good. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Constitutional Convention. It's a story of debate, compromise, and the birth of a nation. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe for more historical stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video. Picture this. April 1789. The ink is barely dry on the new United States Constitution. The air is thick with anticipation, hope, and a healthy dose of anxiety. A new nation has been born, but it's fragile, a grand experiment with no guarantee of success. And now, it needs a leader. Not just any leader, but its very first. Who could possibly fill such monumental shoes? The answer, it turned out, was unanimous. Every single elector cast their vote for one man, George Washington. Now, you might think Washington was thrilled, right? Popping champagne, high-fiving the founding fathers. Far from it. This is where our story gets really interesting. The man who had led the Continental Army to a miraculous victory against the most powerful empire on earth didn't want the job. He was, in every sense of the word, the reluctant president. After the Revolutionary War, Washington had happily returned to his beloved estate, Mount Vernon. He saw himself as a farmer, a Cincinnati for the new age, who had laid down his sword and returned to his plow. He wrote to friends expressing his desire to live out his days under the shadow of my own vine and my own fig tree. He felt his service was done. He was in his late 50s, his health wasn't perfect, and the idea of re-entering the chaotic, backbiting world of politics filled him with what he called feelings of a culprit who was going to the place of his execution. He genuinely believed he wasn't the right man for the job, that his abilities were unequal to the immense task ahead. So, why did he accept? Duty. It's a word we hear a lot, but for Washington, it was the core of his being. Letters poured in from figures like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, pleading with him. They argued that his refusal would be the death knell of the new republic, before it even had a chance to breathe. The nation was teetering on the edge. States were squabbling, the economy was in shambles, and foreign powers were watching like vultures, waiting for the experiment to fail. The people trusted Washington. His leadership was the glue that had held the army together, and now it was the only thing that could hold the nation together. Imagine the weight of that responsibility, the fate of millions, and the future of liberty itself, resting squarely on your shoulders. Washington understood this. He wrote that his movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who was going to the place of his execution. But his sense of duty to the nation he had fought to create was stronger than his personal desire for a quiet life. He felt he had no choice. To refuse would be to abandon the cause. So, on April 16, 1789, he bid a somber farewell to his family in Mount Vernon and began the long journey to New York City, the temporary capital. This wasn't a triumphant march, it was a solemn procession. His diary entries from this time are filled with anxiety and self-doubt. He wasn't seeking power or glory. He was accepting a burden. His journey north was anything but quiet, however. As he passed through towns and cities, the public reaction was ecstatic. Crowds gathered, cannons fired, and bells rang. In Philadelphia, a triumphal arch was erected. At Trenton, where he had famously crossed the Delaware, young girls in white dresses threw flowers in his path. It was a hero's welcome. But for Washington, it only deepened his sense of dread. He knew the immense expectations the people had of him, and he feared he could not possibly live up to them. This public adoration wasn't a celebration of a man seeking power, but a desperate plea for a father figure to guide a new nation. Finally, on April 30th, 1789, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall on Wall Street, George Washington placed his hand on a Bible and took the oath of office. He was visibly nervous. His inaugural address was quiet, almost trembling at times. He spoke of his inferior endowments and his disinclination for the job. He asked for the blessings of Providence, because he knew he couldn't do it alone. This is the incredible paradox of Washington's presidency. The man who seemed least to want power was precisely the reason the American presidency didn't become a monarchy. His reluctance was his greatest strength. He wasn't driven by ambition or ego, but by a profound sense of responsibility. He knew he was setting a precedent with every single action. How should a president be addressed? How should he interact with Congress? What was the proper role of the executive branch? There was no blueprint. Washington and his administration had to invent the American government from scratch. Think about the challenges he faced immediately. He had to establish a cabinet, create a federal court system, stabilize the nation's finances, and navigate complex foreign relations with Britain, France, and Spain. He had to unite a country of fiercely independent states, each with its own interests and culture. Every decision was monumental. Every step was on untrodden ground. The story of Washington's reluctant acceptance of the presidency is more than just a historical footnote. It's a powerful lesson in leadership. It shows that true leadership isn't about the pursuit of power, but about the acceptance of responsibility. It's about service over self. Washington's hesitation wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of his profound understanding of the power he was about to wield, and his deep-seated respect for the Republican principles he had fought to establish. He knew that the office was bigger than the man, and his solemn duty was to serve it, not the other way around. His journey from the quiet fields of Mount Vernon to the presidential chair in New York is the story of a man who put his country before himself, setting a standard for leadership that echoes to this day. Thanks so much for watching this deep dive into a crucial moment in history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more chapters from the past. Let me know in the comments what you think about Washington's reluctance. Was it genuine humility or a political masterstroke? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the life of George Washington. Today, we arrive at the final chapter, a story of farewell, wisdom, and a legacy that has shaped a nation for centuries. So, grab your cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's explore the twilight years of a true American icon. After 2 terms as the first president of the United States, a period filled with immense challenges and nation-building, George Washington made a decision that was as revolutionary as the war he had won. He chose to walk away from power. In 1797, he bid farewell to the presidency and the bustling political life of Philadelphia. His destination was his beloved home, Mount Vernon, the sanctuary on the banks of the Potomac River that he had longed for throughout his years of public service. This wasn't a man being pushed out of office. He was immensely popular, and many Americans would have gladly made him a king or a president for life. But Washington understood something profound about the republic he had helped create. It needed to be a nation of laws, not of men. His voluntary retirement set a crucial precedent, a peaceful transfer of power that has become a cornerstone of American democracy. Imagine the message this sent to the world. Leadership in this new nation was a temporary trust, not a permanent possession. He showed that a leader could serve with distinction and then return to the life of a private citizen. But Washington didn't just quietly slip away. He left the American people a final, powerful gift, his farewell address. This wasn't a speech he delivered from a grand stage, but rather a letter published in newspapers across the country. It's one of the most influential documents in American history, a piece of timeless advice from a founding father to his friends and fellow citizens. He poured his heart and his hard-won wisdom into this message, and its warnings are as relevant today as they were over 200 years ago. What did he warn against? Two main dangers that he saw as existential threats to the young republic. First, he cautioned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. He was talking about political parties. Washington had seen firsthand how the growing divide between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans could create division, gridlock, and what he called the most horrid enormities. He feared that loyalty to a party would eventually override loyalty to the nation itself. He worried that political factions would distract from the public good, open the door to foreign influence, and lead to a thirst for absolute power by a single individual. Looking at the political landscape today, it's hard not to think he was onto something, isn't it? He urged Americans to prioritize national unity above all else. His second major warning was against permanent foreign entanglements. This is often misinterpreted as a call for total isolationism, but that's not quite right. Washington was a realist. He understood that America needed to trade and have relationships with other countries. What he advised against were inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others. He believed that permanent alliances could drag the United States into foreign wars that were not in its interest, entangling its peace and prosperity in the ambitions and rivalries of European powers. His advice was to pursue a foreign policy based on America's own interests, promoting commerce with all nations but steering clear of binding military commitments. This principle of avoiding foreign entanglements would guide American foreign policy for over a century. With his duty done and his final words of wisdom shared, Washington returned to the life he truly loved, that of a farmer and a gentleman planter at Mount Vernon. He threw himself back into managing his estate, experimenting with crop rotation, and designing improvements to his property. He was a man of the soil at heart. These final years were a period of relative peace for him. He enjoyed the company of his wife, Martha, and the steady stream of visitors, old friends, former comrades in arms, and curious admirers who made the pilgrimage to Mount Vernon to pay their respects. He wasn't completely detached from politics. Of course, he corresponded with friends and former colleagues, offering his private thoughts on the unfolding events of the nation. He even briefly accepted a commission to command the American Army once more in 1798, when war with France seemed imminent, though he never had to take the field. But for the most part, his focus was on his home, his family, and the rhythm of life on the plantation. It was a well-deserved respite, a quiet final act after decades of relentless service. Then, in the cold of December 1799, the end came swiftly. On a chilly Thursday, December 12th, Washington spent several hours on horseback, inspecting his farms in a mixture of snow, sleet, and freezing rain. He returned home late and, not wanting to keep his dinner guests waiting, sat down to eat in his damp clothes. The next morning, he woke up with a severe sore throat. His condition worsened rapidly. Doctors were called, and they tried the common medical treatments of the day, including bloodletting, which likely only weakened him further. Throughout his brief, intense illness, Washington faced his final moments with the same stoicism and quiet dignity that had defined his life. He was calm, composed, and concerned for the comfort of those around him. He gave his secretary, Tobias Lear, instructions for his burial and the management of his papers. His last words, whispered on the evening of December 14th, 1799, were simple. "'Tis well." With his wife Martha by his side, George Washington passed away peacefully at his home. The father of a nation was gone. The news of his death sent a shockwave of grief across the country and around the world. America plunged into mourning. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered a 10-day tribute. In Britain, the Royal Navy lowered its flags to half-mast. The sense of loss was profound. It truly was the end of an era. The task of summing up his life fell to his friend and fellow Virginian, Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. In a eulogy delivered to Congress, Lee uttered the words that would become Washington's most famous epitaph: "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen." It's a phrase that perfectly encapsulates his unparalleled role in the founding of the United States. First in war. He was the commander who led a ragtag army of farmers and merchants to victory against the most powerful military on earth. His perseverance, strategic genius, and ability to inspire his men through the darkest of times, from the retreat across New Jersey to the brutal winter at Valley Forge, were the glue that held the Continental Army together. Without Washington, the American Revolution may very well have failed. First in peace, he was the steady hand that guided the nation through its chaotic early years. As president of the Constitutional Convention, he lent his immense prestige to the creation of a new, stronger government. As the first president, he established precedents, built the institutions of government, and navigated treacherous political waters, all while resisting the temptations of power that have corrupted so many leaders throughout history. He proved that a republic could not only be founded, but that it could endure, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. This speaks to the deep reverence and affection the American people had for him. He was more than just a general or a president. He was the living symbol of the nation itself. He embodied the Republican ideals of duty, virtue, and selfless service. His character was his greatest strength, and it earned him a level of trust and admiration that no other American leader has ever quite matched. Of course, Washington's legacy is also complex. He was a man of his time, and that includes the painful contradiction of being a champion of liberty who was also a slaveholder. This is a part of his story that we must acknowledge and grapple with. In his will, he did make provisions for the emancipation of the enslaved people he owned, to be freed upon the death of his wife, Martha. This was a significant step, one that few of his fellow slave-owning founders took. But it doesn't erase the fundamental injustice of the institution itself. Understanding Washington means understanding him in his entirety, the hero and the flawed man, the revolutionary leader and the product of his time. His legacy is not just in the monuments that bear his name or the city that serves as the nation's capital. His true legacy lives on in the principles he championed, in the peaceful transfer of power, in the idea of civilian control of the military, and in the constant, ongoing American experiment of self-government. He's the indispensable man of the founding generation, the central figure around whom the story of America's birth revolves. And so, our series comes to a close. We've journeyed with Washington from the Virginia wilderness to the battlefields of the Revolution, from the Constitutional Convention to the presidency, and finally, back to his beloved Mount Vernon. It's a story of courage, leadership, and a relentless commitment to the idea of the United States of America. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey. I hope you've enjoyed exploring the life and legacy of George Washington as much as I have. If you found this series valuable, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Your support means the world to me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.